Two Guns begins with a man named Bobby driving a car alongside a fellow named Stigman. They walked separately to different locations. Bobby went to the bank, while Stigman walked to the cafe across from it. Bobby and Stigman planned to attempt a theft at a bank where a drug dealer's money was held. Bobby kept track of what was going on inside the bank, while Stigman kept an eye on Bobby from outside. After leaving the bank, Bobby approached Stigman and stated that the bank's security arrangements were poor and that they could easily have stolen from it. They then set fire to the cafe to distract all of the security officials there, allowing them to carry out the crime more easily. The scene then shifted back to a week earlier. Bobby and Stigman traveled to Sonora, Mexico, to see an elderly man named Greco. Greco is one of the most powerful drug organizations in Mexico City. That day, Bobby brought up the false passport Greco had purchased. Greco handed him money as payment. However, Bobby denied the money because their previous arrangement required payment in the form of cocaine. Bobby refunded the money and asked Greco to pay for it again when Greco received the cocaine he requested. Following that, Bobby and Stigman departed Greco's house to the city center. When they arrived at the Mexican border, they were stopped by authorities and arrested on the spot because they couldn't provide their IDs. They were held in a separate room. Bobby was grilled by the head of a DEA agent named Jessup, and Stigman was interrogated by a DEA agent named Debbie. Bobby is also a part of an undercover DEA unit, and Jessup assigned him to apprehend a Mexican drug cartel led by Greco. Meanwhile, Stigman was fully unaware of Bobby's disguise and did not realize he was a federal agent. Because Bobby had failed to apprehend Greco thus far, Jessup offered him 2 additional weeks to finish his assignment. After Bobby and Stigman were released, Bobby went to Stigman's house and invited him to rob Greco's money from the bank. Stigman quickly agreed to the plan. The next day, Bobby and Stigman went to Greco's house to spy on him and his staff. When they saw one of Greco's men leave with a suitcase, they immediately followed the crew car. As they suspected, Greco's men were bringing money into the bank, which they would later plunder. The day before the bank robbery, Bobby went to a hotel with Debbie to spend the night together and tell her about the robbery plot that he and Stigman planned to carry out the next day. Meanwhile, Stigman traveled to a secret place to meet a Marine captain named Quince. It turns out Stigman is an undercover military police officer tasked with stealing Greco's drug trafficking money. Quince then gave Stigman with all of the equipment, explosive devices and firearms he would need to carry out the robbery the next day. Before they parted ways, Quince directed Stigman to kill Bobby after he fulfilled his robbery goal. The next day, they implemented their strategy. Bobby and Stigman approached the bank wearing masks. They entered the bank and pointed weapons at everyone inside, including security guards and bank staff. After telling everyone to lie down, Stigman walked directly into the safe and blew up every money locker inside. Stigman promptly removed the money from the safe and transported it to the car they had prepared. They left the bank after they had loaded all of their money into the automobile. Bobby and Stigman drove to the desert and stopped to check on their money. Bobby and Stigman quickly leveled their weapons at each other, but Stigman acted quickly, shooting Bobby till he slumped powerless. Stigman noticed the badge in Bobby's palm and recognized he was a DEA member. He then left Bobby and drove away in the automobile laden with money. Meanwhile, a CIA agent arrived to meet the bank that Bobby and Stigman had earlier robbed. That encounter revealed that part of the stolen bank money belonged to CIA agents. Meanwhile, Stigman had arrived at the military police headquarters to give over the bank heist proceeds to Captain Quince. After counting, they managed to rob $43 million. When Stigman told Quince that he had killed Bobby, Quince was still skeptical and wanted to confirm Bobby's death directly. Quince and his subordinates raced to the desert, where Stigman had killed Bobby earlier. Bobby, on the other hand, survived the shooting by Stigman with only a stomach wound. He then departed the desert in an off-road vehicle stolen from 2 strangers who happened to be passing by. When Stigman and Quince arrived at the place, they couldn't find Bobby and planned to assassinate Stigman. Fortunately, Stigman acted fast and was able to survive the attacks of Quince's entire army. The shootout between Stigman and the remainder of Quince's forces ended quickly because Stigman was able to flee the scene. Meanwhile, Bobby, who was still injured, visited a veterinary clinic and requested that one of the vets repair the gunshot wound in his stomach. Bobby returned to Debbie in the evening and requested for her assistance in learning more about Stigman's background. Bobby intended to find Stigman and reclaim the money he stole during the previous day's bank robbery. A CIA agent tracked down Bobby, who had previously visited the veterinary clinic in response to complaints of off-road auto theft. The agent inquired with the vet, who had previously treated Bobby, about his whereabouts, but the vet was completely clueless. That night, Bobby went to Stigman's house to find out where he was and what his true identity was. Stigman, on the other hand, was not at the house at the time. He was hiding from Quince and his followers in the next apartment. Bobby quickly tracked down Stigman and inquired about the money they had stolen. Quince and his subordinates had already arrived at Stigman's residence in the midst of their conversation. Surprisingly, Stigman assisted Bobby and notified him of the coming of Quince's forces. Stigman instructed Bobby to flee the area before Quince noticed him. He even helped Bobby eliminate the Quince squad members one by one with the long-barreled weapon he had prepared. The epic gunfire scenario between Bobby and Stigman against the Quince army has finally occurred. Fortunately, Bobby was able to escape after blowing up the facility. On the other hand, CIA operatives approached Jessup and threatened to reveal everything about Bobby's bank robbery. At the same moment, Bobby occurred to stop by Jessup's house, and the CIA officers were able to kill Jessup and capture Bobby in a matter of minutes. Directly to the point, the CIA agent inquired about the location of the bank money that Bobby had robbed earlier. But Bobby replied that he didn't know where the money was. The CIA man then threatened Bobby, claiming he would frame him as the assassin of Jessup and imprison him for a long period. As a result, the CIA agents enabled Bobby to return the money before falsely reporting Jessup's murder to the police. Bobby, who was visibly angry, had little choice but to accept the offer. The next day, Bobby visited Greco's house to inquire about the stolen bank money. When Bobby was ready to arrest Greco, Stigman appeared and pulled him into the trunk of his automobile. Stigman was able to drag Greco away after a shot from Greco's men distracted Bobby. Bobby chased Stigman's car into the desert and began ramming into it. Stigman then forced Bobby out of his car and wrestled him to the ground. Bobby and Stigman's argument was short-lived, as they agreed to work together and confess their identities and missions to one another. Bobby discovered that Stigman was a Marine military police officer. Meanwhile, Stigman discovered that Bobby was a DEA agent. They soon realized they shared the same mission: to apprehend Greco and recover the money from the bank robbery the day before. They ultimately made the decision to work together. In the evening, Stigman and Bobby led Greco to Debbie's garage and began questioning him about the location of their stolen money. Debbie arrived shortly after and was astonished by the trio's appearance. Debbie was upset with Bobby since bringing Greco to her house put all three of them in danger. Unfortunately, Greco's men discovered Stigman and Bobby at Debbie's house and began attacking them. They had no choice but to let Greco leave to get away from terrible area. Stigman, Debbie, and Bobby attempted to flee, but Greco's men followed up and rammed into their vehicle. Their automobile was thrown, and they fainted briefly. However, when Bobby and Stigman awoke, Debbie was not in the back seat of the automobile. Bobby and Stigman were brought to Greco's estate in Mexico and hanged upside down. Greco even battered and tortured them with the assault of a wild cow in retaliation for the kidnapping they committed the day before. Then Bobby had an insane idea: inform Greco that they would return the money from the bank robbery. Actually, neither of them knew where the stolen money was, but they chose to appear to know so that Greco would let them go. Greco accepted Bobby and Stigman's offer and gave them 24 hours to repay all of the money. Before Bobby and Stigman left, Greco threatened to kill Debbie if they didn't return the money. That night, as they prepared to begin their hunt, Stigman stated that the stolen money was most likely still at Captain Quince's post in the Navy military headquarters. The next day, before Bobby and Stigman headed for Quince's headquarters, they prepared themselves with the equipment and weaponry they had obtained from Stigman's old acquaintance. After obtaining the guns, Bobby and Stigman proceeded straight to the police military headquarters to collect the stolen money. Stigman infiltrated the Admiral's office to report all criminal activity by Quince, while Bobby sneaked into Quince's chamber to steal the money. After hearing all of Stigman's answers, the Admiral decided not to intervene in the matter, fearing it would harm their Navy's military standing. The Admiral directed his deputies to remove Stigman from the Naval Army office. Meanwhile, Bobby found Quince and instantly pointed a gun at him, forcing him to open the safe. Quince's safe was opened, and there was no money in it. Then Quince said that Debbie had taken all of the stolen money since he and Debbie had been planning all along to steal it. When Quince's guys caught Bobby threatening Quince, he fled the room. Bobby cleverly searched for a military uniform and disguised himself as a member of the Marine military. Bobby escaped after blowing up the office and outwitting all of the base's security officers. That night, when Bobby was on his way to Debbie's house, Greco called and told him that he and Stigman were too late to return the money, so he killed Debbie right away. Bobby then proceeded to Stigman to plot a trap for Greco before heading to the Quince Hotel and discovering their loot under Debbie's bed. Bobby immediately called a CIA operative to return the money and requested that he be acquitted of Jessup's murder. The next day, Stigman invited Greco to meet him and promised to refund the money. When Greco and his men came, Quince appeared unexpectedly and demanded half of the $40 million that Stigman had given. Stigman intended to pit Quince against Greco. In the midst of negotiations between Greco and Quince, CIA agents arrived with a contingent of troops and helicopters to recover the stolen funds. Shortly after, Bobby arrived in a car laden with stolen money. Bobby gave the keys to the CIA and walked away with Stigman. However, a few seconds after Bobby and Stigman went away, they detonated the car and shot Greco, Quince, and the CIA members to cause a stir. Bobby and Stigman had intended to pit Quince, Greco, and the CIA against each other so they could escape quietly. Unfortunately, Quince and a CIA agent managed to locate Bobby and Stigman. A CIA guy pointed a gun at Bobby, while Quince pointed a gun at Stigman. Both of their places were surrounded, but with quick thinking, Bobby and Stigman were able to turn things around and murder Quince and the CIA agent. They then proceeded to kill Greco, who was dying. They were ultimately able to depart the site and resume their connection. At the end of the film, Stigman invites Bobby to commit another bank heist elsewhere, but Bobby declines because he still has some of the money they stole from their previous bank. The lesson of this video is that greed and abuse of power will only result in more misery and loss.